now to introduce Dr. Mònica Guillén Royo. So Mònica is a senior researcher at CICERO, the International Center for Climate Research in Oslo. Her research focuses on the relationships between well-being and sustainable consumption, drawing on quantitative and qualitative methods and participatory research designs. Topics include the relationships between consumption practices, materialistic values, social comparison, and subjective well-being. She also assesses the factors that hamper or promote need fulfillment and environmental sustainability, such as values, technologies, behaviors, spaces, institutions, and environments. You can see her research on human needs and local transformations towards sustainable societies in her 2016 book, Sustainability and Wellbeing, Human Scale Development in Practice. And of course, she also has numerous publications which you can find online. So without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Mònica Guillén Royo. And Mònica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, for the introduction. And also thank you very much, Francesco, for inviting me to talk about my research on sustainable consumption and well-being as part of this STATEC, the Wellbeing Seminar Series. As you can read in this quote that I have put in the beginning of my presentation, transforming the way we consume is necessary if we are to have at any chance of keeping global warming under 2 degrees Celsius, as we agreed, many countries agreed in the Paris Agreement signed in 2015. By consuming less and by consuming differently, we can achieve a reduction in global greenhouse emissions by 40–70%. Compared to different baseline scenarios that are used in the different IPCC reports. IPCC is the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In this late report presented some days ago, all the researchers, the research that is presented there is based on an exhaustive survey of the current literature. And the conclusion with high confidence is that demand-side mitigation response options are consistent with improving basic well-being for all. So meaning that engaging in sustainable consumption practices is actually not detrimental for well-being. And this is after an exhaustive review of the literature. Today, I would like to give you a little bit of the discussion behind this statement in the IPCC, even if I'm not basing my presentation in exactly on the papers or literature that they use, because I have maybe a different take than the IPCC researchers, but we can discuss this later if you would like. But I want to start talking a little bit about the concepts. What do they mean by demand-side mitigations? Where does consumption fit in the whole thing? And the concepts that are related to well-being. Those, for sure, you are very, you know about the different aspects of well-being that we address in well-being studies. But so it will be very short. But I think it's good to start, talking a little bit about the concepts, and then I would like to discuss a little bit research on subjective well-being and on sustainable consumption. What do we find about this relationship? Is it positive? Is there a risk of a negative relationship, meaning that we engage in recycling, reusing, and consuming less can be bad for us? What are the methodological challenges that I identified or that I think that are interesting to discuss at this point? And then I would like to draw from my the other leg of my research that is less quantitative but more participatory and qualitative based to maybe set light into some of the challenges we find when we research the relationship between sustainable consumption and well-being. First of all, in the first quote from the IPCC report, they talk about demand-side solutions for mitigating climate change. What does this concept, demand-side solutions, encompass. So these demand-side solutions include strategies targeting technological choices, consumption in general, behaviors, lifestyles, infrastructures and systems, service provision, and associated socio-technical transitions. Any policy that addresses some of these topics would be a policy that would be considered a demand-side solution. Okay. When we talk about consumption, we do not only talk about the use of a good, economic good of a product, but we talk about all this cycle of consumption. And this is a good definition by Campbell in 1995. He says that the consumption can be defined as the selection, purchase, use, maintenance, repair, and disposal of any product or service. Okay, it considers also the disposal, what we do with the products we have, isn't it? And that is very important concerning waste, concerning pollution, concerning what happens with the items we consume after we have finished using them, isn't it? And then the concept of sustainable consumption. The concept of sustainable consumption goes back to 1987 to all the discussion on sustainable development, the Brundtland report, isn't it? So if you know about that definition of sustainable development, you'll find the definition that I present here on sustainable consumption very similar. And that is the definition that is very interesting because it has embedded in the definition an understanding of well-being based on basic needs and based on quality of life. And so sustainable consumption is defined as the use of goods and services that respond to basic needs and bring a better quality of life, while minimizing the use of natural resources, toxic materials, and emissions of waste and pollutants over the life cycle, so as not to jeopardize the needs of future generations. So here we have current generations that are consuming, producing and consuming things, and future generations that should be able to produce and consume things to also achieve high levels of quality of life. And yet, if we achieve this balance, we are engaged in sustainable consumption processes. When we address well-being, well-being can be defined or classified depending on the discipline that we have as a background. We would talk about subjective or objective well-being if we are economists or social psychologists, and then we distinguish between what is perceptions, subjective well-being, or what is external accounts, Human Development Index, and we will call this objective well-being. If we are more in the social psychology, ethics, and perspective, then we might use hedonic and eudemonic well-being. But here I have a very general and overarching definition of well-being. That is the one that the research group in which I did my PhD actually was using. If you read this one, it has input from psychology, from economics, from ethics, and from anthropology, because we had anthropologists in the teams as well. So it's very interdisciplinary. So I think when we address the relationship between consumption, sustainable consumption, and well-being, we actually can do it from all these very different perspectives on well-being. Understanding well-being as relational, understanding well-being as need fulfillment, understanding well-being as happiness or positive emotions or negative emotions. So we have a diversity of perspectives to address this topic, and actually the current literature uses these very different perspectives to address this topic. But what does reality tell us? What are the current figures tell us? So basically, this is taken from a 2019 paper on biophysical boundaries and social threshold. And what we see that currently, the countries that provide for higher levels of well-being And this here they account also for subjective well-being. They account for indicators of life satisfaction. So are countries that transgress many of the 7 biophysical boundaries that they account for in this research. Okay, so this is the situation we have, and this is what we hear always, from policymakers. Yes, we are achieving high levels of well-being. We are giving our societies, we have jobs, we have good houses, we can provide for quality healthcare. But it's at the stake of the environment, and this is how things are, isn't it? And if we don't consume as much, if we don't use our resources as much, we will not be able to achieve these high levels of well-being in our societies. But but this happens against what the planet Earth is experiencing, and it's experiencing that climate change, increasing in variation in floods and droughts. It's experiencing a high level of pollutants. It's experiencing a huge reduction of fresh water available for human consumption. So there are many biophysical boundaries that are transgressed. And also we have often the tendency to think, okay, so then let's fix the production side and not think of the consumption side. But even the IPCC now says, but if we focus on consumption, we actually can reduce emissions from a 40 to a 70% from baselines that go from 1990 to 2000. So we actually have something to do here. And the big question would be, can we actually achieve high levels of well-being by engaging in sustainable consumption practices? Can we change this figure? Can this figure be changed, reversed in a way, and most countries, can they go towards the top left corner of this figure, isn't it? And this is the big question. So what is the available evidence telling us about this topic? So I start with Tim Kasser's paper from 2017. And this is a review paper that starts telling us that most empirical studies analyzing the relationship between engaging in sustainable consumption practices like recycling, cycling to work, taking public transport, eating less meat and fish, conserving water, buying secondhand, for example, and different measures of subjective well-being, from life satisfaction to happiness to other measures more related to psychological need fulfillment. So find that there is a positive relationship, that actually those who engage in this sort of behaviors actually declare to have high levels of well-being. Okay? Most of the studies, it's true, that find this positive relationship are of a cross-sectional nature. And the statistician and economist among us, they will say, okay, warning sign, isn't it? Because that might be, that raises many questions about this finding. And Tim, who is a very bright social psychologist, actually talks about this. Why are we finding consistently across countries and across different cultures a positive relationship between engaging in these environmental behaviors, PEBs, and subjective well-being? He says it can well be that in our current societies, those who engage in saving water, not using plastic bags, but taking their own bags when they go shopping, not owning a car, but engaging in using collective transport or cycling. Those guys are actually happier to start with. So are happy, jolly people who decide to engage in these practices. It could also be, following him, that we are actually not accounting for aspects of or for characteristics of these people that actually affect both their happiness and their likelihood to engage in these practices, like what their values are they more materialistic or less materialistic, whether they already live simply than most people in their the average in their countries, or whether they practice mindfulness, for example, which has been found to be a factor that affects both people's happiness and their engagement in sustainable consumption practices. He also, Tim Kasser suggests that it could also be that by engaging in reusing things, finding alternative uses to things we have at home, sharing tools and equipment, clothes with others. So we actually contribute positively to fulfill our psychological needs for relatedness, for competence, which is learning, knowledge. Isn't it? We learn a lot if we reuse things because we use our imagination, isn't it? Or we just Google how to transform something that we have and give it a new use, But we learn. So it could be that engaging in these practices actually taps on helps meet our psychological needs, and that is why we experience happiness. So he points to that. So then, I'm not saying that is from his paper, because his paper also summarizes previous research, but there are many papers published after this review that have explored some of his suggestions. For example, I wrote a paper based on data from Norway, and I found that yes, personal aspirations, whether people are more or less materialistic, and spending time outdoors are both contributing to high levels of well-being and are also related to whether people engage in sustainable consumption practices or not. And this is also found in other papers. A very recent, a very good paper by Capstick also finds this across cultures. And they analyze different cultures to try to see whether there are differences in the way that in the relationship between consuming sustainably and well-being by culture. That is a very interesting paper as well. But there are interesting things that the different papers tell us that it is difficult to generalize about this positive finding and about the elements that are important to account for when we study the relationship between sustainable consumption and well-being. For instance, is it good for everybody not to be materialistic? Is it good for everybody not to appreciate having a higher income, not to appreciate having a better house, not to focus our lives on those material aspirations? And for example, we did a research in Peru where we studied this materialism across socioeconomic groups, and we found that yes, in general, yes, it is good both for people's well-being and for people's engagement in sustainable consumption, to base their lives in non-materialistic, have non-materialistic values, have non-materialistic aspirations. But in an area such as slum, where it is quite difficult to live based on intrinsic motivations, on non-materialistic motivations, because actually there is a lot of competition. There is competition for land to get to put your hat on, to a competition to get the few jobs, possibilities of work and income available, competition for getting your children out of the streets and into some sort of local school possible. Yeah. So in these areas, having non-materialistic values might actually not be as good for well-being as in wealthier areas. So this this had only previously been found in prisons and among inmates, prison inmates. In that context, people who prisoners who have non-materialistic values as the as predominant, they experience a lot of frustration because a prison is not a context where you can realize these non-materialistic values. So their well-being is way lower than the ones who do have materialistic values. So the context is important, and that we learn through our research in Peru. And then what they find in when they do these studies across cultures, because the study that I just talked about was only focusing on Peru, but there are the study that I present next to this one in a study from CAPSTEC. They actually compare different countries at different levels of development. And they also find that that there is a strong relationship between environmental behaviors and subjective well-being across cultures, but that the effects do not change for those with non-materialistic values, for example. So the issue of values is nothing that we can actually make big statements about, and it is important to take into account when we study the relationship. We say, okay, if we just instill into our students at school the right values, isn't it, then they will behave sustainably. Well, we don't know this yet. We still do not have a strong evidence for that across countries and across socioeconomic groups. So we should be cautious when generalizing about the importance of instilling intrinsic values in general in all groups of our societies. And finally here, we have also, I have included in this table, a paper that actually tried to see whether the relationship, the positive relationship that we find in the literature between engaging in sustainable practices and well-being actually holds when we have panel data, meaning that when we study this relationship with data that comes from the same people for a period of time, at different points in time. And they find that that actually the significant positive relationship disappears when they use panel data. So have I presented a little bit of a confusing evidence about this relationship when drawing from this recent research? Maybe. But I think even in the chaos of the findings that we have from empirical studies, we can conclude one thing. And this is a very important thing, which is that we don't find evidence of a negative relationship. We don't find evidence at all that engaging in sustainable consumption practices is actually bad. for happiness, or bad for life satisfaction, or bad for subjective vitality, or bad for any other measure of well-being that we might use, because all these different papers use different measures of subjective well-being. So that is something that it's very important, I would say, and we can use actually for to argue for like maybe imaginative or even quite tough measures to change our consumption patterns towards sustainability.
Monica, if I may, just a clarifying question. For all of these different studies, so you're referring to this PEB, right? It's the Sustainable Consumption Practices. Can you give us an example of what those include? I'm thinking, are people really reducing their consumption? Or maybe they're recycling more, because you said sustainable consumption includes multiple aspects. Can you just give us a little bit of an intuition for what those can include in these studies?
Yes, and I'm going to talk about this in the next section where I present the challenges, because that is a very good and a very important question. Here, everybody uses different measures of pro-environmental behaviors, okay? And usually you have from cycling and taking public transport instead of commuting by car, for example, to eating less meat and fish, to buying secondhand. You have different behaviors with very different impacts on the environment and also very different impacts on our well-being. Okay, all these behaviors are in some of the papers included under pro-environmental behaviors, and they are usually addressed as a composite index, not individually. Okay, and that is also an issue that we can discuss later, because, and yeah.
I was going to say that's really helpful. So sorry, I'm anticipating where you're going, so I apologize for that, but that's helpful. Thank you.
No, but it's great. It's great because this is what I was going to address now. All these papers, they make me think of, they raise different conceptual and methodological challenges, in my view. One is that what are we capturing? Are we capturing behaviors? Are we capturing practices? It is very different taking a transatlantic flight to go to a conference. Very different than taking a transatlantic flight to visit your grandparents. It is very different. And do we capture this when we ask about how many transatlantic flights have you taken the last 5 years, for example? And the meaning for well-being is very different, even if the meaning for the environment is the same. Then high versus low mitigation potential. Are we actually addressing the pro-environmental behaviors that lead to significant reductions in CO2 emissions, for example? The impact of recycling versus eating less animal protein. It's very different. This impact is there's a huge difference between these two behaviors. And then environmental behaviors are only at the individual level or at the collective level? Do we distinguish between these two? So concerning the first one, behaviors versus practices. So we usually define pro-environmental behaviors as individual or collective actions that actually contribute or are perceived to contribute to environmental conservation. So a common question capturing individual or collective pro-environmental behaviors would be, please look at this card and tell me how often you personally do each of the following things. Take fewer flights when possible, take your own shopping bag when shopping. For example, this is from the English Household Survey. Practice is something that is very different. Practice, it's a routinized type of behavior which consists of several elements interconnected to one another. And these several elements are often defined as infrastructures, norms and values, and your resources, your knowledge, your competences. So a question, for example, that could capture the practice of cooking would be how often do you make low carbon meals? For example, vegetarian, vegan meals, or meals based only on local seasonal ingredients, and with the option to the respondent to answer on a Likert scale. These are very different types of questions. It's easier to ask about behaviors than ask about practices, because asking about practices is a bit complicated. The practice is commuting. The practice is visiting your family. The practice is eating out, isn't it? Whereas behavior is taking less flight, using reusable bags when going shopping. So we usually use pro-environmental behaviors, but the question here is this the right measure to analyze the relationship between sustainable consumption and well-being? And I don't know, I'm just posing this as a reflection here. Then the next aspect that I wanted to discuss was high versus low mitigation potential. Because if you see here, here we have the questions that are included in the household survey, in the panel household survey in the UK. So they are asking people the frequency of switching off lights in rooms that are not being used, putting more clothes on instead of turning up heating, not buying things because too much packaging, buying recycled paper. You see the list of behaviors they capture in this survey. And if I've tried to associate to this behavior their mitigation potential, you know, drawing on the paper from Wines and Nicholas. This is a very interesting paper from 2017 where they analyze how books in Canada address books for children, you know, for school books, address the topic of sustainability. And they realized that the topics that are mainly addressed in these books are of behaviors that have from moderate to low mitigation potential, and that it's only driving less that is one of the high mitigation potential behaviors that is actually addressed often in the books. But in the UK household panel survey, we find that there are only two pro-environmental behaviors that might have from a moderate to a high impact. You know, taking fewer flights when possible, and walking or cycling for short journeys, less than 2 or 3 miles. You know, so we might have a challenge here as well. You know, because if in most of our surveys we focus on aspects like buying organic food, taking shorter showers, recycling. So we are actually focusing on moderate to low impact behaviors concerning the environment. But it is true also that high impact behaviors are rare. They are not generalized among the population. So what happens is that we would get a lot of zeros if we only ask about behaviors with high mitigation potential. And as you can see in this chart, obviously this paper was very controversial because the top measure with the highest mitigation potential was having one fewer child, and people didn't like this. but there were letters to the editor against this paper because of this. But anyway, I still believe that composite indexes based on these questions give us a good approximation on whether people engage in pro-environmental behaviors. Okay, but as I said, using just focusing on the items separately, it would maybe not be as useful. But most of the studies actually addressed the behaviors as a whole. But I still think it's important to reflect on what we are capturing when we study this. Yeah.
We have about 5 more minutes for the main part. So.
Okay. So yes, so I'll try to go a bit quicker. So yes, and another issue is that whether we are focusing on private sphere pro-environmental behaviors that only have a direct impact on us, or a public sphere pro-environmental behaviors, things we can do with others, isn't it? And they might have a very different meaning when it comes to well-being, and mainly when the collaborative pro-environmental behaviors imply being an activist and being involved in demonstrations, for example. Now we see like the Extinction Rebellion, for example, how you say, scientist rebellion as well, that are calling all us scientists to rebel and to ask for tough action to our public officials on climate change. So will this, one big question concerning this is whether the impact of engaging in activism, pro-environmental activism, might be good or bad for them for well-being. Could it be that the benefits of feeling part of a group, of socializing with like-minded people, crowd out the fear of being detained by the police, for example? We don't know. So this is an open question, and I think it is important to continue research to answer it. And finally, I was thinking, okay, so we find at least that we don't find a negative relationship using drawing quantitative studies between sustainable consumption practices and well-being, or sustainable consumption behaviors and well-being. But why is this? Could we look at this issue from a different perspective? And I've done a lot of participatory research, drawing on Manfred Max-Neef's perspective on needs. So not that much on happiness or life satisfaction, but focusing on needs, understood as a list of needs that we share across cultures. And here you have the list of 9 needs that Manfred proposed. And he says also that across society, in different cultures, we have ways of being, having, doing, and interacting that are different and that help us meet our needs. Okay, he uses to present his framework in this sort of matrix with empty grids. And this is very useful because we can go to groups, communities, and talk to people and say, okay, how do you meet your need for subsistence nowadays? How are people here? How are our institutions? What do we have to meet the need for subsistence, identity, freedom? And through these discussions, we can actually see where sustainable consumption is placed. And when we carry out these discussions in different contexts, with poor people in a slum of Lima, with rich people in Oslo, so we find that sustainable practices like using a collective transport, cycling to work, consuming less in general, are usually considered as practices that are that are positively contributed to needs fulfillment. So people feel that the possibility of being engaged in sustainable practices is good for them. This is people themselves, not ourselves analyzing data from surveys in our offices. But this is discussions with people around this matrix that I presented here that say, yes, in an ideal situation, I would like to walk to work, cycle. If we had good cycle paths, safe, isn't it? Rather than taking the car, I mean, I really would like to live without car, but we value going, being very quick, being able to reach different places very quickly. So we would need other values as well if I was to sell my car and just use collective transport. So what we understand from this research is that actually, yes, the sustainable consumption practices are something that people desire, wish to engage in, but that societies are not prepared to offer the other elements that should be there for these practices to be really contributing to well-being in a strong way, you know? So it could be that when we ask in our surveys about engaging in these practices, sustainable consumption practices or environmental behaviors, we are not finding a strong relationship because societies are actually do not have the other elements that make that these practices are actually strongly related to happiness or well-being. Okay, and this is a hypothesis from putting together two very different strands of research, one based on quantitative studies based on regression analysis on survey data, and the other on qualitative analysis of workshop data. But, and this is the last slide, which tries to summarize what I've presented here. We find that there is no evidence of a negative relationship between engaging in environmental behaviors and sustainable consumption practices and sustainable well-being. The lack of strong evidence of a positive causal relationship might be due to conceptual and or methodological challenges, some of them that I pointed to in this presentation. But I also find that strong positive relationship emerges in participatory studies on needs and satisfiers, but only in conjunction with values, norms, regulations, infrastructures, forms of organizations and spaces that support its fulfillment. If these supporting elements do not exist, the relationship might not be as strong as we would wish. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Monica. Quite interesting sort of background and research here. So what we'll do now is we'll open it up for questions. And as I mentioned before, what you can do is raise your virtual hand or type in the chat. Also, if you have any difficulty with English, we have a few people here who speak different languages too. So feel free to write in whichever language might be most comfortable with you, and we'll get it translated by somebody as we kind of talk about.
Should I stop sharing? Should I stop sharing?
You know, it's fine either way, because sometimes we'll go back to your slides. So, but it shares quickly. So yeah, maybe stop sharing, and then if we need to reference a slide, we'll go to it. Okay. And the first question looks like it's from Sama here. Sama, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi. Thank you very much, Monica. I think we've met before. And I'm sure you're aware that I'm going to say it on a very similar page, with our work with the Happy Planet Index. We've been trying to make the same case that good lives don't have to cost the earth. I guess I've got two related points though. So one of my points is a little bit in contradiction to that, and I guess is to really push back on your first conclusion that there's no evidence of a negative relationship, because and you've already made this point, no, that the ways that PEBs are measured are mixed, not always, they're not always picking up the best picture, the best way of measuring it. But most importantly, a lot of these measures are well, they're subjectively measured and they're quite relative. So like the question that I saw on the few slides, do you fly less when possible? So for one person, that might mean, oh, I only fly 10 times a year. I sometimes make video conferences. And for another person, that means I don't fly less. Another person might say, no, I don't fly less than possible. I just don't fly because I haven't got any money. So I wonder, I'm surprised that there haven't been more studies which have tried to measure environmental impact more objectively. And as you said, composite indexes, composite measures may be more suitable. So things which try to capture carbon footprint or ecological footprint or something like that might be more effective. Often that is still subjectively measured. So there's kind of, but at least that, that might help in some way. Because I suspect that actually, if you don't control for anything else, people who pollute more and use more resources are happier. If you don't control for income, etc. I think it's pretty sure, definitely at global level, and I'm sure if you look within a country as well, people who are wealthier in most countries tend to be happier, and they tend to produce, have a bigger negative impact on the planet. So that's the one thing. But then I guess it's kind of trying to make the positive point, which links to what you were saying at the end when you were reporting the participatory discussions. This idea that it's really it's the society, it's the systems, the infrastructure that determine that. And I'm just wondering if there's been any research which has tried to look at that quantitatively as well. So, for example, having a car tends to be associated with people who don't have cars have lower subjective well-being generally. But is that effect weaker when you live in a city, for example, where there's lots of where there's good public transport, compared to if you live in a small town where there's only one bus a day or whatever, that sort of thing? So looking at how that relationship between environmental impact and subjective well-being, which I contest is negative actually, but seeing if that depends, and I'm sure on the context. But yeah, thank you very much, and really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you. Yes, very, very important points, the ones you made, Sama. And yes, I haven't referred to this paper here, but there is a paper, but I can send you the reference later, with data from Belgium, where they actually use ecological footprint instead of frequency of engaging in different practices as a measure. They also do not find a negative relationship between low ecological footprint controlling for income and other variables, that would be strongly associated to that. And this is why I was discussing, tried to say that also focusing on single practices or on single behaviors might be a bit problematic, because they also say that people who didn't have a car were unhappy, and obviously not having a car in certain contexts might make you unhappy because you cannot reach work or you cannot take your children to nursery because of the context in which you are, isn't it? So yes, there are papers that use ecological footprint. There are not many, because it demands a battery of questions that sometimes you cannot include, and also because you have to adapt the impact to local circumstances. So it's not the same energy mix, the one we have in Norway and the one they have in Belgium or the one you have in the UK. So that it has to be very, very strongly contextualized. But some of there are some papers, and they also do not find a negative relationship. But I get your point, and some of the other issues that you were talking about, the car and having a lower impact, being less negative for you if you live in a city where a good collective transport or like availability, isn't it, might be less negative. Yes, I haven't seen this type of research.
Okay, thank you. So at the moment we don't have another question in the chat, so I'll opportunity as the co-host here. And what Sama raised and your response makes me think of a couple of things. So these pro-environmental behaviors, as far as I think they're measured generally, especially the subjective ones, they're voluntary behaviors, if I understand correctly, mostly, right? And so we, kind of the neoclassical economics definition, if it's somebody's following through with something, then there's revealed preference, it's what they would want, it should lead to a positive outcome. And so the results would be very different if we were looking at, let's say, forced behavior. And we've had changes in the United States recently where and I think many places, but they're charging you for the shopping bags, for instance. And so that's a forced behavioral change. And the shopping bags is, the cost is quite nominal, so it's not unaffordable. So, I wonder if, people have looked at, something like this as a pro-environmental behavior that was induced by government, and how people responded to that. So that'd be one question, and then quite related. This leads me to believe, because they're voluntary behaviors, that what we need to do is change people's preferences. And so I wonder if you agree with that. I'll have plenty more questions, but I'll give other people an opportunity to ask first.
Yes, I think this is also an extremely important question. But would preferences not be associated to aspiration or values, for example? Because I would say they are. So people who have a relatively intrinsic orientation, for example, they would be those who would engage more in sustainable consumption practices. They would be so yes, the preferences would be more aligned to these environmental behaviors are the ones who have a relative more materialistic orientation, for instance, or extrinsic orientation. But still, attitudes and values and aspirations are often controlled for in this type of studies, and still do not change much the results. Sometimes they reduce the strength of the positive relationship between behaviors and well-being, but still they don't. They are not strong enough to reverse the sign, for example. Mainly in some studies it might become non-significant, but as I said, yeah. So yes, changing people preferences would be to working on their values and aspirations, and that is one of the ways that social psychologists have been advocating for, basically through reducing advertising or banning advertising on high fossil fuel intensive products. And yeah, so yes, I think it's one of the possible ways forward, actually.
Okay, great, thank you. I can follow up, but we have Dr. Bava has a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hey, I'm sorry I'm not able to connect to the camera, otherwise I would have it on. Thank you, Monica, for the wonderful presentation. And can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm a systemic psychotherapist who works at the intersection of communal and community and clinical practices and focus on well-being and relational practices. So that's my background coming in. And my question is around measurement and comment. And I feel like there's a subtext to what you've been raising here today that I think is really important. I wanted to highlight it and see if I'm hearing you in that vein or not. And that is how well-being is measured. It can be a relational measure, it can be a need-based measure, it can be happiness measure. And often well-being has been informed by that happiness measure, which is by the nature of its measurement has been also subjective. So as we talk about subjective and objective measures, but we use subjective well-being measures, that makes me question some ideas around how do we deal with this dilemma of measurement that you're raising? But it's not limited to well-being. I think you're also speaking to this, in the closing, you were speaking to this idea of individual behaviors versus practices. And I think our practices are sustained by our social, by what is afforded by our communities, by our governments, by the communal spaces we occupy. And so it's not enough to just measure the individual, even though individual behavior is the most easiest measurement to make. And the third piece I'm bringing is this distinction of the binary of intrinsic versus extrinsic. And I may not be understanding it fully, so I'm just going to put it out there. But are we missing something by thinking about it as intrinsic and extrinsic in terms of materiality, by not noticing, coming back to well-being, the interconnectedness, the relational aspects of what we are doing? And then it comes out very clearly in the Peru slum study portion of it, right? Of how one wants to improve their life because they want to send a child. That kind of material aspiration is deeply connected to well-being. So I'm going to just leave it at that level of measurement and language, and not just language as in, but what are we creating when we create these binaries, and not looking at the interconnectedness of those. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the comments. And yeah, that are very important, because basically I might have given the impression that I talk in binary terms when I talk about intrinsic and extrinsic values. But if you hear social psychologists, which I'm not, they talk about it's a continuum, isn't it? And it is the balance between the two. We all hold extrinsic aspirations to an extent, and we all have intrinsic aspirations to an extent. But which are the ones that have a heavier weight, or like they weight more on our everyday life, isn't it? So what we try to measure is how they compare extrinsic to intrinsic aspirations in individuals, the relative weight of those. But they are, even if they are opposed when they use psychometric measures to analyze them, they understand that there is an understanding that both exists inside ourselves, isn't it? And so that it's probably because I haven't been precise enough when I have been discussing about this. And I think I try to link my work based on workshops and systemic perspective, because Maxim's perspective on well-being and needs fulfillment is a systemic perspective, not based only in cause and effect, but based on relationship between factors and elements, to what we find in the subjective well-being literature. But it is difficult. And I actually haven't written any article where the findings from subjective well-being research based on very like sound and empirically sound and quantitative research link to qualitative research and findings from participatory approaches that are conceptually and theoretically very sound, but based on other ontology and epistemology concerning an approach to science. So how do we make compatible findings from approaches that see a system operating to findings from approaches that are based on analysis of cause and effect? It is really difficult, and I still haven't found the answer to that. Yeah.
Thank you. Francesco, you're next.
Thank you, Mònica, so much. I would like to briefly go back to the distinction you introduced about between private and public pro-environmental behaviors. I'm not sure you used private, but I definitely remember, let's say, the individual pro-environmental behavior and the social one. I think that that distinction is quite interesting, and in particular, I'm curious to know more about the interaction between these two levels of pro-environmental behaviors. Or even if I can be more specific, I wonder if there is any evidence that individual pro-environmental behaviors could be more strongly correlated with well-being when they are performed in a society where there is more trust in others. And this would be because protecting the environment is clearly a joint task. And if you believe that everyone will cooperate to achieve that common task, then it's more probable that you will adopt pro-environmental behaviors, and that this can also be associated with well-being and lower consumption. So I wonder if this relation has been studied, and if you have any idea on this.
Yes, actually, but I don't think it's exactly what you say, because what you suggest, because actually the paper by Capstick, they distinguish between public and private sphere pro-environmental behaviors, because they want to study whether public and private sphere public pro-environmental behaviors have a stronger relationship with well-being in more collectivist cultures, on the one hand, and on the other hand, whether private sphere pro-environmental behaviors have a stronger relationship with well-being in more individualistic cultures. So they actually test that. These are some of the hypotheses they want to test in this study. And they actually find evidence for the public sphere collectivist societies. So they find some indication of public sphere pro-environmental behaviors being more strongly associated with subjective well-being in collectivist societies or cultures. In their sample, actually, the individualist cultures, I think, are UK and Denmark, and the collectivists are India and China, I think. Yeah, so there is some evidence, but not concerning trust. So trust would give another dimension to this question, I think, measuring trust.
Thank you. Thank you. That's quite interesting. Thanks also for clarifying the distinction between these two levels of pro-environmental behaviors.
Thanks.
We have the next speaker. I'm not sure if I'm getting it in the correct order. Maybe Giles or Schlesser. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
I think Dr. Bava was before, but.
Dr. Bava went already, so you're okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So Mònica, thank you for your excellent presentation, and I would go in the same direction as Francesco. Also on the differentiation of individual environment behaviors and collective behaviors. Because if we talk about environment impact, why are we doing this? We do this to have a better environment, so a better, less pollution, better food, etc. So individually, you can have persons that do it, that are extremely active, and but they see that there are not enough persons working in the same direction and can be less happier. So if you do a lot of positive behaviors for yourself, So if you, for example, eating, it's you can have more sane food intake, and this is more individual decision and approach. But for example, air pollution, when we see there are a lot of deaths worldwide, also in slums. So this is quite different. So this need for better air quality can, even if a small group of persons are doing as much as they can, you don't have the result. So for me, it's also the measuring what individuals do collectively, what is coming out as a result for society. So and here we come with the collective impact. So I mean, it's important in that way that with the state of environment worldwide and the problems we have, individualism, and a lot of individuals know that what they are doing will never be enough. So they can be very unhappy with that. And others not doing anything, they are much happier because they don't care. So you see that, and you see this in discussing with young and older persons, that because I do a lot, but I don't see an impact. Because the impact is important to do the link with the happiness. So I hope you understand a little bit my point, that on different needs we have, as I take the example of air sanity, or not good air, that here it is extremely important that there is a public move and a collective move to get a level of better, because if I am healthier, I will be happier. So the link between health and happiness, I think, is an important one. We're talking about subsistency, etc., and social relations. So we come back to the points that you made and saying that are the 6-7 basic needs of people. So I think that this aspect of health for as a society and even for the planet as a whole is important. And my question is in how could we more measure this with the impacts, and to have a way in I would say to get the problems resolved, because that's the point where you will have happiness. So we have an objective, you can reach it, that makes people happier. So if you do a lot of things and you do not reach the objective, as for example, no polluted air, there's probably a link, because you're not happy because you obtained this result, and you are not as much healthier as you could be with your individual, as not using the car and not doing and not taking the plane, because you don't have this impact. So I stop here. So it's just that point. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you raised a very important question. With the research we did in Granada with Nazareth, who I thought was here actually, what we find is that those who engage in activism, they actually were not happier, isn't it? And probably this was a cross-sectional study, so probably you engage in activism for the environment because you see that things are really going to hell, and the water is more polluted, the air is more polluted, the resources are being exhausted. So you actually want to change things. But those who felt very close to nature scored high in one a scale that was capturing how close you felt as an individual from nature, how you felt as part of nature. Those who scored high on that integration with nature. So this negative relationship didn't exist, so they didn't feel unhappy by participating in demonstrations, for example. So yes, there is a lot. This is an open area to actually explore with research. We don't have the answers right now, and I think they are very important. Those are very important questions, and we have to actually get into those and address them properly through research. So a very important point. But still, also now, you know, that these movements, environmental movements, are saying, okay, if just a 3.5% of the population engage actively to change norms, to change rules towards pro-environmental, so pro-environmental behaviors become easier, are facilitated and unpolluting, or non-environmental behaviors are more difficult to realize or are banned, or instead of giving premiums to those who fly more, you know, you actually tax people as they fly more than one flight or two flights a year, you know. So if we mobilize more than 3.5% of the population, we actually can change things. And there are big meta studies saying that 3.5 is the key percentage of the population we have to engage in this sort of movements.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, were you responding there?
No.
Sorry, I didn't want to make sure. I thought I heard someone else speak up. I think this is a good time to close. So we're 15 minutes after our scheduled closing time. So I appreciate, Mònica, you for staying the extra time, as well as the audience for their participation and also staying as well. So I'll just say thank you very much. We will be updating the website with the video for this talk, as well as the schedule for upcoming talks. And again, our conference this summer, wellbeing2022.lu. Please send us an email if you have any questions. I hope to see you here again or at the conference or both. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mònica. It was great to hear to you and to get to actually know you. We never met in person.
No, thank you very much. It has been great to discuss with you about these topics.
Thank you. Bye.